Washington, D.C. has some of the biggest and best museums in the entire world. If you're planning to visit, I have 11 essential tips to help you get the most out of them. Starting with tip number 1, which is to understand the Washington, D.C. museum ecosystem. Many visitors and tourists, and even some locals, refer to all museums in D.C. as Smithsonian museums, and that's not entirely accurate. The Smithsonian Institution is a collection of museums, research centers, and a zoo. There is no singular place called the Smithsonian. Instead, there are 11 distinct museums that are on the National Mall and a scattering of other Smithsonian museums around the area as well. The best known Smithsonian museums are the Air and Space Museum, Natural History Museum, and American History Museum. The best thing about Smithsonian museums for most visitors is that they are truly top-notch institutions and completely free to visit. That said, there are other free museums on the National Mall that are not part of the Smithsonian Institution. The National Gallery of Art, for example, is a huge collection of over 100,000 paintings, portraits, drawings, and other works of art. The U.S. Botanic Gardens is essentially a big museum of plants. And the National Archives, while not primarily a museum, does offer amazing rotating exhibits that you can check out. My point in all of this is to say, when you're coming to Washington, D.C., don't just hyper-focus in on the Smithsonian museums, because you might miss some other great stuff that's out there too. By the way, if you're new around here, hello. My name is Rob. I'm a tour guide and founder of Trip Hacks DC Tours. On this channel, I share my best tips, tricks, and travel hacks for visitors who want to explore Washington, D.C. And I'm curious to know if you've ever been to a museum in D.C. before, and which ones you had the best experiences with. So leave a comment down there and let everyone know. Tip number 2 is to know which museums require tickets or reservations. Because so many museums in Washington, D.C. are free, timed tickets are used for crowd control. In most cases, the ticket is free, but you still need to get one. For example, right now in the summer of 2024, the Air and Space Museum does require free timed tickets. So does the African American History and Culture Museum. And the ticketing system can and will change. During COVID, at some point, every single museum required tickets, though over time, many of them dropped those requirements. Sometimes individual exhibits will require a ticket, like when they had the Kusama exhibit at the Hirshhorn Museum. It's always best to double check the museum website before your trip to make sure you know what the ticketing situation is. Tip number 3 is don't write off the less popular museums. Washington, D.C. has many amazing museums, but they do not get equally strong attendance. Last year in 2023, the Natural History Museum got 4.4 million visitors, while barely a mile away, the National Postal Museum only got 170,000 visitors. That's a 25 times difference. Is the Natural History Museum great? Yes. Is it 25 times as great? I don't think so. Now, this doesn't mean that I'm telling you to skip the Natural History Museum, or that the Postal Museum is a must-do. Museums are very personal. What's best for you and what's best for me might not be the same. I'm just saying not to simply write off a museum because it's not one of the most popular ones. In a similar vein, tip number 4, don't write off museums that aren't on the National Mall. The National Mall has a huge concentration of museums between the Capitol and the Washington Monument. But that's not the only area of DC that has museums. One of my favorite off-the-mall museums is the National Portrait Gallery, which I like a lot because to me, it's a hybrid art and history museum. It's located right up the street, about half a mile from the National Mall. Another cool museum, the Renwick Gallery, focuses specifically on crafts and decorative art, and is located right across the street from the White House. The National Mall is great, for sure, but don't feel like it's the only place where you can find great museums. Tip number 5 is a big one. Don't get museum fatigue. Museum fatigue is a very real phenomenon, and if you try to cram too many museums into too short of a trip, it will hit you. Museums require a lot of walking and standing, which is physically draining, and a lot of reading and interpreting, which is mentally draining. And that's how you get museum fatigue. The reason why this is a particular problem in Washington, D.C. is because so many of the museums are free that you can feel like you have to go to all of them. Unfortunately, most trips to Washington, D.C. are simply not long enough to accommodate a substantial number of museum visits. Think of this another way. If you were visiting a destination where the museums were not free and you had to buy a ticket to visit each one, you wouldn't just buy a ticket for every single museum and then try to cram them in. You would figure out which one or two sound the most interesting to you and buy tickets for those. That's the same strategy you should use in Washington, D.C. Instead of thinking of the cost of admission in terms of dollars, think of it in hours. Time is perhaps the most important currency on a trip. You want to use it wisely, and you don't want to waste it with museum fatigue. Tip number 6 is wear comfortable shoes. Comfortable walking shoes are critical when you visit Washington, D.C. I've mentioned this many times before in videos on this channel, but I don't want you to think that you can skip the comfortable shoes on your museum day because you're going to be mostly indoors. I track my personal steps on this smartwatch, and many of the days that I clock the highest numbers are museum days. Don't underestimate how much walking you're going to do back and forth and around the exhibits. The last thing you want is to not be able to enjoy your day because your feet are in so much pain. Tip number 7 is for the early birds. Go against the flow. Most museums in Washington, D.C. open at 10 a.m. A few a little bit earlier, and a few a little bit later. If you like to get to the museums as soon as the doors open, and you don't have particular exhibits that you care about more than others, then start with the exhibits that are farthest away from the door. This might mean going up to the top level or going to the far back or sides of the museum. Studying a museum map, even for a few minutes in advance, can help you figure this out. This is an old hack that I learned when I worked at an amusement park as a teenager. Most people behave in a predictable way. As soon as the gate opens, they go inside and straight to the ride that's closest to the entrance. So the rides at the far end of the park often have short lines or no lines for the first couple of hours. And this same strategy can apply to museums too. Tip number 8 is pack light. The good news for visitors is that most museums are less strict about what you can bring in compared to other federal government sites, like the Capitol and the White House. Generally, you are allowed to bring bags, backpacks, and strollers. Depending on which museum you're going to, you may be required to wear a backpack on only one shoulder or on your front. This is generally to prevent you from accidentally swinging around and knocking into any precious artifacts. If you do bring a bag, it will be searched upon entry, so make sure you don't have anything on the prohibited items list in there. You can find a prohibited items list on each museum website, but basically it includes things like weapons, tools, or anything else that can damage museum exhibits. But it also includes things like tripods, monopods, and selfie sticks, so leave that photography equipment back at your hotel. Most museums do allow outside food, but only if it's in a properly sealed container. And you are only allowed to open it in the cafe part of the museum. Which leads nicely into tip number 9, which is have a plan for lunch. If you have members of your group who have allergies or are just picky eaters, you can pack them your own lunch. Just make sure it's properly sealed in Tupperware, Ziploc bags, or whatever else you have to seal it up. I have to say that museums have actually improved their cafe offerings quite a bit in recent years. If you haven't been to DC in a while, your memory of museum food might be the McDonald's at the Air and Space Museum, which, as a tour guide, I feel like was kind of a traumatic place. Nowadays, most museums have a cafe with some solid food options. It's not going to be award-winning or probably even very memorable after your trip, but it'll be solid. My favorite museum cafe is at the National Museum of African American History and Culture. The National Museum of the American Indian is also a popular choice. The Hirshhorn Museum has Dolcezza, which is a local brand that serves coffee, iced coffee, and gelato. If you don't want or like museum food, there are plenty of fast casual restaurants downtown just to the north of the National Mall. And I've made a few cheap eats videos so you can watch those and find out what some of my favorites are. Tip number 10 is about beating the crowds. Since they are free and amazing, many museums in DC can get very crowded. But is there any way to beat the crowds? The answer depends entirely on when you're going to be in DC. Tourism here is seasonal. High season is spring break and summer break, and low season is in the dead of winter. If you come in January or February, you will experience the museums with smaller crowds. If you come during peak season, you can sometimes find smaller crowds on weekdays than on weekends, because a lot of local families like to bring their kids to the museums on Saturdays and Sundays. That said, if you're coming during 8th grade field trip season, which runs from roughly mid-March through mid-June, and is the heaviest in May, then all bets are off. If you come during field trip season, there are going to be kids on field trips everywhere, including the museums. Sorry. That said, student group itineraries tend to be pretty basic, so you are more likely to find them at the most popular museums and less likely to find them at the less popular museums, which is another reason to refer back to my previous tip about not writing off the less popular ones. Tip number 11 is don't be afraid to split up. Like I said before, which museum is the best is actually more of a personal question. I am personally a big history buff, and that's why my favorite museums tend to be the history museums. Other people are less into history, but way into art, so the art museums tend to be much more enriching to them. A lot of families and groups are afraid to split up, and they wind up taking a big group into a museum that some people might be into, but others might not. And when you have people in your group who really aren't into the museum, especially when those people are kids, it can kind of degrade the overall experience. So if you have multiple adults or teenagers who are old enough to take younger kids into different museums, don't be afraid to split up. I promise it's okay if you don't spend every minute of your trip with every member of your family. And hey, since you made it this far, I highly recommend watching my 50 Things to Do in DC video next, so you can get some inspiration about where you want to go. Just go and click or tap right over here to watch it next. Enjoy your trip.